community callouts list has been released for Splatoon 3 and can be found in the link in the description of the video. For those unfamiliar with callouts, this is a list of names for different locations on the maps, so that when you play on a call with your teammates, you can name map locations quickly and without causing confusion. I already have a video about best practices for using callouts, which is also linked in the description and should be giving you a link in the upper right hand corner right about now, but this video will be a guide specifically for how to use the callouts list. The reason this list exists is that without it, the callouts aren't going to be very standardized. While this tends not to be a problem within steady teams who often add to or change the callouts lists for their own use on the team, having a standard one helps immensely with communication on pickup teams or new teams that aren't familiar with each other yet. And it also serves as a good model for best practices for callouts, because some of y'all are better at figuring out what to name things than others. Given that the callouts are intended to be standardized, returning maps are generally going to use pretty much the same callouts as they did in their previous games. That said, there may be some minor changes here and there, and some maps like Mahi Mahi or Hammerhead, while the same map in name, are completely different in their layout, so these required substantial reworking of the former callouts. Furthermore, some of the Splatoon 1 maps simply weren't very standardized. You can find at least 3 different resources for Flounder Heights callouts that name areas differently or leave out callouts that others include. Flounder Heights' callouts have needed to be synthesized from those various resources, so they may be slightly different than the resource you remember using for them. An important feature of these callouts is that they're very short names. The goal on comms is always to communicate as much information in as few syllables as possible, because Splatoon is an insanely fast-paced game. Words take time to form, speak, hear, and process, and fractions of seconds matter. Most callouts on this list are only 1 syllable long, and almost every other one is only 2. As you'll notice, only half of every map is labeled. This is because all of the Splatoon maps are symmetrical, so instead of giving different names to otherwise identical structures, we just use an adjective to distinguish our ramp from their ramp, or right alley from left alley. Different adjectives will be appropriate for different locations. For example, on Hagglefish, it's not especially obvious which team controls which alley. Is left alley ours because we have higher ground over it and it's harder for them to approach us from there? Or is right alley ours because we can more easily retreat to our side of the map if we're in there? In this case, and others like it, I generally recommend using right and left instead of ours and theirs. But right or left can be confusing sometimes, since they're directions that are relative to where you're facing. If you get turned around, it can take a little extra mental effort to figure out whether your left side and the team's left side are different and get the direction correct. It's usually a lot easier to tell whether you're on your team's side or your opponent's side, so being able to use our versus their to describe those locations is useful instead. As you look through the different maps, you'll probably recognize a lot of the same names popping up from map to map. It's useful to learn these common names and figure out what kind of map geometry they describe, because even if you haven't successfully memorized all of the callouts yet, if you know that a court, short for courtyard, is a large, flat, low ground area, when you hear it on comms, you can probably figure out what they're talking about anyway. In FLC's document about the callouts for Splatoon 2, he includes a guide to these common callout names that has largely been followed for the Splatoon 3 list. I've linked this guide in the description, but here are a few FAQs about the terminology. Snipe, according to FLC's guide, refers to a high raised area overlooking low ground. Whether he meant to include that definition or not, it has also come to be accepted as a name for the most common location to find a backliner, so the location you're most likely to actually see someone sniping. A few locations that meet FLC's criteria of high ground overlooking low ground may not necessarily meet the criteria of also being the most popular locations for backline weapons. If a returning map is largely unchanged from the previous game and the community has been using those callouts for some time now, those kinds of locations are still just going to be labeled snipe, but effort has been made to ensure that new maps or significantly changed maps don't have areas labeled snipe unless those areas meet both criteria. Bats, which shows up a lot, is short for battlements, as in the top of the outer wall of a castle. This is usually a long, narrow, high ground area near a team's spawn, often the last line of defense. Plat is short for platform or plateau, a flat raised area. Cat is short for catwalk, a high, narrow bridge often made of grates rather than paintable material. I won't get too much further into these as, like I said, you can find them in FLC's document linked in the description. Not every callout is a common one you'll see across many maps, but most of the non-standard ones refer to a unique visual feature on the map, like tree, beams, booth, and so on. Hopefully the callouts are making it out to everyone early enough that we can collectively adopt them. I know Ludi is just getting started now, and teams may have already prepared using different lists, but hopefully we can all come together eventually and be speaking the same language, because that's going to make things a lot more convenient for everyone. That's all I've got. See you in the enemy bats!